Assalamu alaikum, brothers and sisters. So that was a really interesting conversation we had with our sister who's doing studies on the Shia-Sunni conflicts in America. It was a very interesting topic. We spoke about the consequences of holding either an atheistic worldview or a theistic worldview. And we spoke about how to arrive at a conclusion that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, is a messenger from God and the Quran is from God. If you thought that there was a fire here, and you're heading towards, and I was heading towards it, you'd say to me, even if you didn't know me, just out of decency, you'd say to me, "Excuse me, sir.
Please don't do that.
Don't stay away. Don't go that way because there's a fire there."
There's danger there, right?
So if we believe that there's a way to live in the world that will take you away from the hellfire and closer to God and paradise, it's almost out of love for our fellow human beings that we would inform you, and this is where it's coming from.
Yes.
So Islam is, overarchingly, it means submitting your will to the will of the Creator. This in a nutshell. And that means you believe in the Creator as the Creator describes himself, and you follow the messenger that comes to you and the way of living in the world that will give you an ultimately paradise. This is sort of part of that. Now, ultimately, there are people who don't really want to submit. And you'll find it's amazing the myriad of approaches that people use to justify that lack of submission.
Something that always existed, something that is very powerful, incredibly intelligent, and has a will to bring things into existence. Now that we would say the question arises, how do we know that if there are good reasons to believe that something like this exists, how would we know whether this thing has communicated with us? Because if it hasn't, then we're just guessing as to what our purpose of life is, what we should be doing, what we can do and can't do, and what have you. And so for Muslims, we would say, look, that's the Quran. That's revelation, linking you to that necessary existence, which is the Creator, that informs us about Him. And we say Him in a linguistic sense, not as a masculine or feminine, because we believe God doesn't have gender. But to understand God and know Allah, you have to have that information from Him. And then more importantly, of course, or as importantly, we would say, your reason for your existence. Why am I here? What am I doing? Where am I going? And so we would say that the best explanation for that would also come from the Creator. And so what we've done here, basically on the presentation that we've got here, the banners, is preservation would be one of the very important aspects of any scripture, and it differentiates the Quran from other scriptures, because we do believe that the Bible in its original form, which were the words given to Jesus, were from a divine source, and that's why the Quran says the people of the book, referring to the Jews and the Christians. So it does regard Jesus as a prophet of God and Moses as a prophet of God, but we don't worship Jesus, we don't worship Muhammad, we don't worship any man, basically. But what we've done here is we've just demonstrated that the Quran is preserved, and then there are lots of reasons to believe as to why the Quran is a miracle from God. So if you like, I don't want to make the conversation too long and then you sort of think, my God, this is like just way too much, But we've got free copies of the Quran that we'd be happy to let you have. It's a good English translation, and any other literature, and we'll give you our email address. But if you'd like to ask any questions about any aspects, the sister here, she's studying she's studying the Sunni and Shia divide. So she's not religious herself, but she wanted to in America, right, at university. So that's the subject that she chose.
What made you into that topic?
Yeah.
I don't know. Growing up, I was raised Catholic, and I didn't learn about anything else other than that. When I went to university, I started, just being interested in things I didn't know about.
Yeah.
Different cultures, different religions, languages. I've taken many different languages at this point. I've studied many different
Oh, have you really? Yeah?
Yeah.
What languages have you done?
I've taken Chinese. I know
Okay.
a little of American Sign Language.
Okay.
I'm studying Arabic. I'm
Oh, wow.
very elementary with it though.
That's fantastic.
So when you were studying, so it sounds like you've got a fascinating background. When you were studying this topic, what did you learn?
Well, I'm still studying. I've done a lot of literature reviews.
Oh, sorry. So apologies. Speaker's call now.
I've done a lot of like literature reading and such like that, and I've started to do some interviews with people in the U.S. and also here in the U.K. I'm actually working with the Iraqi Welfare Association right now.
Okay.
But kind of, I talked to him a little bit about it. Is that what I'm really interested in is the political and the religious nature of it, and how it relates to another.
Yeah.
And how that developed kind of over time.
Yeah.
Specifically in Iraq, how like leadership, I'm looking at Saddam Hussein presidency and how that kind of stirred things up, and hopefully right now it seems to be on the decline. So just kind of looking at that trajectory.
So did you, when you were studying, because our interest in this is probably the more religious side of it. When you were studying, what did you find anything about Islam that came up in your studies, or did you not? Because you're from a Catholic background, and then you're studying a topic to do with Muslims. So did you see any sort of did you see any religious aspect to it, or was it all political?
When I first started, my first 2 years of university, I was definitely interested in politics of the region. But I got into a research program that was, you had to do research on something religious.
Okay.
So that's why I roped the both of them together.
Okay.
And at first I took the approach of how the religious aspects developed into political, and I kind of found that to be, like, some people have told me they had thoughts against that.
So from our perspective, because what I'm really interested in is to give you some information about Islam that maybe you haven't come across and might be able to useful for you. But just on the topic that you're talking about and you're studying, from our perspective, it was initially just a political disagreement. All it was a disagreement about who should be the next leader after the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him.
Yeah.
And that was really all it was. It was political. There wasn't very much any theological aspect to it, religious aspect to it.
It was succession.
It was succession, purely that. So purely a political thing. And then later on, these political issues became entrenched. And then some people, to sort of justify their position, started to bring in religious justifications for it. And then you see some theological things being attached to that political position. But for us, really, the key thing is that the Shia form a very small portion of the Muslim world, 8% or something like this, less than 10%. And we agree on many things. There's an overall agreement. So we agree in who God is. We agree on the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, being the final messenger from God. And we agree on the revelation, which is from God, which is the Quran. And this is the things that these are foundational things. And the rest of them tend to be sort of either people have taken individuals and raised them in status beyond what they should be. So some people, the imams. So for example, we believe that God is all-knowing. He's the one that knows everything, and one that knows what we call the unseen, so the things that we don't have access to. Some people give this ability, they give it to the imams. And we would say this is a form of association. You're giving the creation a quality that only belongs to the Creator. In a similar way, sorry to give this overlap, but in a similar way, we say to the Christians a similar thing with Jesus, peace be upon him, that this is a human being, one of the greatest people that ever walked on the earth, born of a virgin, did miracles through God's permission, raised the dead, etc. We believe all of this about him, peace be upon him. But none of those things take that individual and make them into God himself or divine. And we ask the Christians not to do this. And there is a bit of an overlap in the concepts between the way that some Shia, not all of the Shia, because even the Shia are not a monolith. Even amongst them, there's different groups. And some of them you couldn't distinguish from the Sunnis. And other groups are very far in their sort of theology. So there's a big overlap. So when you're studying this stuff, what do you find about Islam that raises questions for you? Do you have anything that you think actually this doesn't make sense? Because we claim to be Abrahamic, right? So we claim to be followers of the religion of Abraham. Do you see that in your studies, or do you think?
Yeah. I mean, there's definitely like historical, like the three Abrahamic religions, they all have historical similarities and founding from the same place. So, I mean, yeah.
Sorry.
And what do you think of that?
I think it's interesting how now today the three are so far apart politically, and that there's a lot of conflict between the three Abrahamic religions, and then within them it's interesting and frustrating that they all came from the same place, and it's a belief system, so why do we have to be mad at each other's belief systems? So it's interesting to me.
Yeah.
I think even in that, you'll find that a lot of it is geopolitical.
Yes.
And then the religion is again used as a means to either justify or wash away the conscience of doing the sort of harsh things to the other groups or whatever. But in reality, the Quran says that, and it recognizes the people of the book, as I said, the Jews and the Christians. And it even says, even amongst the Jews and the Christians, there are believers. In other words, there are people who've adhered to the teachings of Moses and the true teachings of Jesus, and they would be also considered to be believers, and they would also go to paradise, basically. But it's the ones that have now, as Imran said, have elevated Jesus to a position of being divine and being God. This would be, and has always been regarded by all of the prophets previously, as something that's blasphemous, that you can never do, that you can never worship any of creation except for the Creator.
Can I ask you a personal question? What led you said you were raised in a Catholic family. You're not Catholic yourself?
I wouldn't identify as that. I don't know what I would identify as, really.
So did something lead you away from that?
Just growing up, like, it was just about following the rules, and I don't think I ever found myself truly believing in it. I don't know.
So do you believe in any aspects? Do you believe in God, for example?
I don't know.
We just went through the contingency argument.
That's where we started.
We just went through the whole contingency argument.
Okay.
Yeah,
And I think the sister admitted that it's a... I think, if I'm right in assessing that you said that it's a good argument. Whether you fully accept it or not, obviously, I don't know, because we didn't get to that. But,
So there's another way of looking at it is, because there's two choices here. I'm going to have a dichotomy, but there's two real choices here. Taking out the I don't know bit, because I don't know is not really a choice. This is sort of, I would say it's a cop-out to a certain extent.
I feel like you can still be contemplating and still unsure.
Absolutely. But in that contemplation, that's part of the journey. It's not arriving at any position.
That's true.
So if we say there's two outcomes, one is there is a creator, and the other one there isn't. And then we have to look at what is the consequences of this for a human being, for you and for me. What are the consequences of holding that position on our lives? Yeah. So one of the consequences of being, let's say you don't believe in God. You say God doesn't exist. Okay. There's no real evidence. I follow the science. The science is not sure. I'm going to hold back on making a decision. This is your position. So then, you are really a product of natural processes. From the Big Bang onwards, the galaxies formed, the stars formed. We have the Earth forming, some sort of life starting. These are all amazing things and not explained. But let's just assume all these things are. And we are just then one of a billion creatures that have just through random processes arrived at our state. And we look at things and we think, I'm married, I have children, I have parents, and we look at these things and we think they have value. Like you have parents, I assume they're with you, yeah, which is you're blessed for that. And you hold them with value. They have value in your eyes. Ultimately, though, in a world where everything is just rearrangements of chemicals through random processes, the difference between a rock in actual value and a human being in actual value, there isn't one, because they're both the end of the same process. One just happened to turn into like a thing that doesn't move and doesn't talk and doesn't think, and there's us, right? So we lose value. Nothing has value. It's just arbitrary. Which for me is a problem, because actually I think things actually contain intrinsic value. I think all human life is valuable. And one of the reasons for that is because the life giver has told us that this is valuable. Life is valuable. So the contrast to that position is that the universe is not just a random jumble of events that led to us, but actually there's purpose behind it, there's intent behind it, and we have not only a value but a role, a purpose. And so the value comes from this transcendent being. He tells us that this is you are a creature that I've created which has value, and this is your purpose. The opposite of that is if you go back to the atheistic view, is actually I have no purpose. If I can give myself purpose, but that's arbitrary. So an example would be a mass murderer. He's giving himself or herself the purpose that I'm going to just kill as many people as I can. And if I've done that, then that's my purpose. You can say, no, my purpose is to really look after people and be charitable. But then how are you going to convince the other that they're wrong? Because it's just, your purpose is self-given, and their purpose would be self-given. So those are two things, so meaning, value, purpose. From that atheistic perspective, they're not really there. The universe is a cold, dark, purposeless, valueless, meaningless place that we just happen to be in because of some processes. What are your thoughts on that? I mean, that's a lot I've told you. I'm just talking about the consequences.
You were not expecting such a deep conversation today, were you?
No.
My apologies.
It's all right.
But
I would say like the same thing back. Like even with religion, I don't think it's the complete opposite. I don't think that necessarily gives you full purpose. Like we're still the same. Like with or without religion, with or without believing in a creator, not necessarily gives you to change your purpose necessarily. Like, say for that mass murderer, like they could, even if they have a religion and they deeply believe in that religion, they could still be a mass murderer and believe that is their purpose. That doesn't change that.
So this is really good, right? So because you're saying actually there's no differences in the positions. You can get someone who is religious do bad things. The question becomes, is the person that's doing the bad things who has a religious belief, is he following the one who's giving him the purpose and telling him what? So, for example, God says in the Quran, I've created you to worship me, human beings, you've been created to worship me. And it tells us that killing one life is like taking the life of all of human beings. And saving one life is like saving the life of all of human beings. Now, if you have someone who then kills, giving themselves that purpose, what they're doing is they're rejecting that guidance.
That's your interpretation. There are many people out there that believe that what they are doing is their own interpretation of their religion. For example, like there are many cults out there that believe that their interpretation is that it's the end of the world, so it's my time to die. So that's what they do. Yeah. And that's their interpretation. To them, that's correct. That's not rejecting the religion. That is them following through on it. So I feel like it all depends.
So the example, because what you're using is you're taking, say, an example of someone who is following, I would say they're misguided. They're following someone who is genuinely taking advantage of them. And then they haven't used an evidence-based system to... There's no sound.
No.
Okay.
It's not my mic.
Michael
corrected.
Sorry.
I'll correct you.
So the purpose, what they've done is they've followed someone who is, I would say, obviously misguiding them. Now they're naive and that they followed them, but their actions they can put down to their faith. But if you look at the texts of all the major faiths, none of them say kill yourself. None of them.
No, yeah, I agree. None of them say that.
Yeah.
But some people do end up interpreting that way in every religion.
So no, they follow an individual who tells them to go in against the text that they're following. Does that make sense?
Well, not if it's their own interpretation.
No, but the thing here to remember is that you're right to some extent. The issue, however, is that how can one either justify or challenge that position? And the Quran says, if you speak the truth, provide your evidence. So if somebody says, I'm doing this in the name of Allah and I want to go and slaughter all of these people, yes, he could do that. That potentially might be his interpretation, or he might just be simply using it because he wants to conceal what's the evil in his heart. But either way, we would then say, okay, provide your evidence. And so the interpretation itself is only justifiable if it can be backed up by evidence. And what we find in Islam is that there are categoric, precise teachings that are agreed within consensus. So we're talking about overwhelming consensus of scholarship. And I would say lay people, that such practices actually are not evidence-backed, and in fact they are a deviance from the religion. So what I would say is that, so similarly, an atheist might say, we're a product of a primordial soup, a collection of bacteria, of atoms and what have you, and therefore actually me going killing this nation and stealing its resources is precisely what we do, the survival of the fittest, right?
Evolutionary advantage. Yeah.
Evolution advantage. I would say most atheists, though they might not be able to argue against that from a definite position, at least within consensus and through their intuitive feelings, would probably argue that, look, it's still wrong to do that. But now I could argue, but no, atheism, he's atheist.
But
You're an atheist.
There's a sort of step in between. I think this is where so the point I was making about the contrast is really to do with the consequences of the position. Then you have to. There is a step in between deciding what to follow, and that step is determining if the communication that this being who's responsible for bringing the universe about has communicated with us. You need to go through a process of verifying that. So it doesn't mean you follow everything blindly. So if someone was to say to you, the world's going to end in 2 weeks, you have to come and be in this camp somewhere and take this drink, the Kool-Aid, and everyone dies, then you need to, you wouldn't follow blindly. So in Islam, we have the term iman, which is translated as faith, but actually means arriving at using your rationale to arrive at the position that the Creator exists, and you have faith in that. Now, so we don't believe in a blind following. So have you read any of the Quran at all, or in your studies? Or
I've read little bits of it, yeah.
So you'll come across phrases often. Do they not reason? Do they not use their faculties of thinking? Do they not understand? Do they not reflect? So we're being told, human beings are being told always to reflect and think upon whichever position that they're thinking about the universe, why we're here, what we're for, and then you would come to a conclusion that this is the correct position to be. We never follow on blindly. So one of the step in between which religion and what rulings to follow, and therefore these people are drinking the Kool-Aid, whether they're following religion or not, that the step is actually the rational process of thinking about it. So one of the things I would say is really important is to look at, if we let's assume for argument's sake that there is a being, a Creator who brought about everything that we understand, brought us about with a purpose and gave us value and meaning in our lives. If that person communicated with us, he would have chosen someone to communicate us through, because going to everyone, we're in that same position. Say if God, some people say to me as atheists, well, why didn't God just speak to everyone? Well, you'd end up with everyone claiming whatever they want as the way, and we're in that same position of no one knowing actually which is the right way, because someone can say, no, well, God told me that I have to slap you every Thursday, and that could be, then you wouldn't have no way of challenging that. So what you need is actually
that explains the bruises.
That explains the bruises. So what you need is you need the information to come to an individual who disseminates it, just as we have in our companies. The companies, you'll have the CEO who gives the information to the next, and then it's disseminated to everyone then to act on. The question comes is, are there people who've made the claim that God has communicated with them and they bring a product, a book or a revelation for the people to analyze? There have been many. In every single culture, every single language, every single region, there are people who make this claim throughout the history of man. So this claim has always been present. All you have to do is to analyze some of these claims. So most of the claimants have been specific. So, because you're Catholic background, Jesus, peace be upon him, according to the biblical narrative, he says that I've only been sent to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Really clearly, this is in the context of the Canaanite woman who comes to him to help heal his daughter. You remember that bit? I don't know if you remember.
Vaguely.
So there's there's a section in the Bible where the narrative goes that Jesus was his disciples. A non-Jew Canaanite woman came, knelt before him and said, "Help me, son of David, for my daughter is afflicted with the devil." And Jesus walks away from her. And so then she gets to the disciples and says, he's not talking to me, what's going on? And so they go to Jesus, and in the narrative it says, they said that, tell us what she's coming after us. And then he says to the disciples, I have not been sent except to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And then she says to him, according to the narrative,
and he says it's not befitting for the dogs to
get
the bread of the... Well, I mean...
So he says that you can't take the children's bread and cast it to the dogs. The children being the Jews and the dogs being the Gentiles. So this is what they say. And then she says, she says something that convinces him that...
Even the crumbs, even the dogs deserve the crumbs.
Yeah, from the master's table. And then he says, great is your faith. And then what he does is he then heals their daughter. But the point in the whole narrative is he specifically says to the disciples, I have not been sent except to the lost sheep of the house. So he's very specific, this is who I've come for. So if you look at most...
This is also confirmed in the Quran, by the way, where he was sent to Bani Israel, he was sent to the people, or the Jews, the Hebrews, basically.
So the reason to tell you that is an example of someone specifying their message is for this people. Now, if you read the Quran, what the Quran says is, I've been sent to all mankind. Oh mankind, and then they answer, then something will happen. You have been sent, talking to the Prophet, the Quran says, you've been sent as a mercy to the worlds. So it's an open message for everybody. So I think what would be good to do is look at the message and the messenger, analyze them, see what you think. Are they sincere? Does it make sense? And does it fit the idea that this has come from something like a divine source? And then you would be in a position to almost like backstage. If you can establish that this is something that humans couldn't have produced with the Quran, and the Prophet, peace upon him, his life is something that would fit the life of a messenger from God, then you could say, okay, if this is true and the messenger is the messenger from God, therefore God must then exist. It's a way of working back from that. A lot of information. I don't want to talk at you. What are your thoughts on that?
I still think I'm not, like, you're correct in that God, if there is one, talks to these specific prophets, and from there it works down. Yeah. I agree with that, but I think that even if it works down that chain, not everyone is going to hear the same things the same way. That there's different interpretations for anything. Whether it is a CEO in a business, someone may hear something, we get off at 5 o'clock, be like, okay, I can leave at 5 o'clock, or like, all right, I can wrap up earlier than 5 o'clock and I can be out of here before then. Like, everyone interprets things differently.
How would you mitigate that? If you're the CEO now, yeah, and you've given this instruction to your manager, yeah, who's going to disseminate the information, how are you going to make sure that the information given to that one who's going to disseminate it, because you've explained to that one who you're giving the message, they understand it.
Yes.
How would you then make sure that understanding is passed on as you intended? How would you do that? If you were going to design a system.
Well, if I see that being an issue, then I could be like, okay, I'm going to be more clear with my instructions. But in the case of the prophets, they can't see hundreds of years down the line and be like, oh, they're interpreting it differently. I need to go back because the prophets are no longer here anymore.
So how would you I'm giving you the problem now, because we have an answer to this.
But what I'm saying is that the prophets can't fix the problem. They can't mitigate the problem because it's thousands of years down the line now, and people are interpreting things differently.
Sure. So because you're taking one ability away from the source to say that they can't see into the future, because the source that we have is all-knowing. So the future is something that's already known to the source. So the question is, you as an all-knowing CEO.
So you're saying the CEO is God?
Yeah. This is it. So you're the all-knowing CEO. You've got someone now who's going to disseminate your information. How are you going to? What process would you put in place to solve that problem? And the reason I'm putting it this way is I think you're going to come up with the same answer that the Muslims have.
Well, I would say in that case. So I would say in that case, either have another prophet later down the line to reinstate those things and make sure that they are clear down the line, but we haven't seen that happen.
Sure.
All these prophets are from thousands of years
So that's
ago.
one
and we're
way.
still
So bring another
waiting
prophet.
for those.
Sure. So that's one way. But any other ways?
I don't see another solution if I'm because them at that point were trying to make sure that interpretation, if they could see in the future, they were trying to make sure that interpretation remains correct.
Yeah.
But as a CEO, the information that you've given to try to mitigate the confusion, especially from the fundamental foundational concepts. So the minor issues might not be necessarily important because they may have no significance in terms of the running of the company, let's say. But the core issues, how would you facilitate that knowledge to reach the...
Not just the knowledge, the interpretation of it. So now, because the issue was interpretation, right? It's not the knowledge. The knowledge can come. So this is your book.
And also limit the scope of interpretation. What would you do as a strategy?
I don't think that there is a way to limit the scope of interpretation.
I think there is.
So one way that you could, as a CEO, do. So if you look at most religious texts, someone putting this is the text, and then people over time interpret it, and then they try and understand what's going on. One of the things that Islam has, which is different to this process. Sorry, I don't want to bore you or anything. I'm just going to.
I'm sorry.
Okay, that's all right. So.
She's maybe tired.
Yeah, probably tired. You're probably tired. So
Imran's voice is very much
soothing.
I'm a bit sort of loud, and but Imran, it's a soothing voice actually, because I can understand.
My apologies, I'll be less soothing. So one of the things that you can do is actually charge the one who's giving the revelation also with the task of explaining that, and have that recorded separately. So do you understand the difference?
Yes. So you're saying that.
Documentation,
for example,
clear documentation.
Yeah, for example, God spoke to Prophet Muhammad, and Prophet Muhammad was also told to be as descriptive as possible. And
so no, that's right.
So no.
Yeah,
okay. Then what do you
almost. So the revelation is given, and the revelation is communicated to the people. So when the Prophet would receive revelation, peace be upon him, he would recite it, and the companions they would write it down. They would scribe it down. So there were like up to almost 70 scribes. And people would scribe and they would have this, so they would memorize it. So it was a text that was given verbally, immediately recorded and memorized by the people who were around them. Yes. So no sort of editorial process. When the revelation would come, if there were things in it that weren't understood, the prophet would be asked the question, what does this mean? So for example, an example of in your fasting, there was a verse about you stop fasting when you see the threads, the white thread and the black thread of lizard. So what happened was that some of the companions were actually literally getting a white thread and a black thread, and they were trying to see if there enough light to see the difference of this, and then it means I can eat. And when this came to the Prophet, he explained this is not what it means. What it means is actually when talking about when a certain part of the dawn and the horizon how it appears. And so the meaning of that verse was clarified. There are lots and lots of examples like where the companions they hear something, don't know exactly how to interpret, and they went to the Prophet who clarified, no, this is how you apply this information. And we have a vast body of literature, the Hadith collections, which really are explanations of how to practically apply and to understand and practically apply the Quran in whichever context. So we have even in those things, there are examples of where the Prophet, peace upon him, may have said something, and God has corrected him. The interpretation we're talking about now.
Yeah.
There are examples where the Prophet might have said. And I'll give an example of this. So someone came to the Prophet, peace upon him, and the Arabs had an odd way of divorcing sometimes. What they would do is they would say to their wife, "You are like the back of my mother," and that meant that they were divorced. And a lady that this happened to, she came to the Prophet and said, is this something that, he's divorced me like this, is it okay? And the Prophet, peace upon him, what he said was, this is part of our traditions, this is our culture, so you're divorced. And then a verse was revealed where this is explained to the Prophet, that actually, no, God has heard the woman that came to you, and this is how you should do it, this is not allowed. So then the Prophet, peace upon him, corrected his previous statement by saying, no, this type of divorce is not allowed in our religion. So you're not divorced. Your marriage still stands. And that was the way. So we have the revelation, we have the interpretation of the Prophet, peace be upon him, which is also corrected and kept clear from error by the same source with the CEO. And then we have that going through time. So if you look at, so I would say that's an unusual aspect of Islam, in that we have not only the revelation itself, but its explanation, which is also guarded and protected from the main person that's disseminating.
But we still see different interpretations today.
And that's the key. I was going to just give the caveat that the core foundational concepts of what it is to believe in God, worship God, the Quran, Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, the reliability of the Quran, of the Hadith, this is something that is unanimously agreed. There are minor differences there are minor interpretation differences on aspects that are not creedal. So in reality, they're not part of your belief or the way that you would believe. And that includes things like violence and things like that. So the Quran itself makes that assertion. It says, in it are explicit verses and ambiguous. And the ones with a disease in their hearts will turn to the ambiguous ones. So it's also preempting that concept that some people might turn to ambiguities in order to make major rifts or changes, and it warns against that. Now the beautiful thing actually with this concept is that we don't find these major creedal differences within the mass of Muslims when it comes to those fundamentals. So in reality what we see is that it has worked. So somebody being violent, for example, would be 99.9% of scholarship, and people would be in agreement that this is outside the fold of Islam, that this is not permitted in Islam, to go and bomb a school bus or something and kill innocent people.
Yeah, that's 100%, not even 99%.
Well, I would say 99.9%, because you might find the one person who's actually not truly a scholar, a self-appointed scholar who brings certain verses together and then says, my interpretation, you can go and do this. But what I'm trying to say to you is that we would be more charitable when it comes to interpreting somebody's beliefs or somebody's concepts, whereby we would not look at the very extreme elements of that to somehow justify some commonality in terms of acceptance or belief. So sorry.
No, that's fine.
Yeah.
So I would say that we have that as a protective aspect of the interpretation of the original revelation.
And we see that in a practical sense it's worked.
The other aspect of it as a CEO is you would never want your original message to get lost,
corrupted.
So that the preservation of that original message should always be there, because if you're the person below the one who's distributing, and that person says to you something, you think, oh, that doesn't sound quite, I'm not sure if this is, you can go and check the original message, because the message is there, and you can say, oh yeah, that makes sense, and that gives it extra.
My question to you guys is, why leave the ambiguity at all?
Well, one of the hikmah, one of the beauties about Islam is that it is relevant throughout time. So there might be some instances where there's ambiguity, where the scholars will look at environmental issues and give a ruling specific to the needs of the people, and also looking at the original in terms of what might be, for example, good at one time may actually not take into consideration cultural changes over time, but that ambiguity may actually allow you to take those cultural sensibilities into consideration. So one example would be, at the time of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, marriage was often, when a person reached puberty, they were considered a woman and they would be married. But the Prophet, peace be upon him, said that one of the aspects to judge such an issue would be cultural as well. So if the cultural norms were that the age was much older, then you should also abide by that. So it allows that flexibility. But we believe that this is from Allah's wisdom. And again, the ambiguity or the ambiguous verses do not affect the the creedal foundational concepts of the religion, and they certainly do not extend to acts of what we would regard as criminality or violence. Those are very clear.
So there's a purpose for ambiguity as well. This is because you're asking about why not make it completely clear? Why leave no doubt, and so that the person no longer has a choice but to understand that I have to accept this and I. So one of the.
We'll say hello in a minute.
Sorry.
He's a bit of a stranger. He comes every year or something.
5 years, he says.
So one of the things that is really important to understand is the ambiguities aren't such that will lead to, like Abbas was saying, some of the things that people complain about, say even the warring between inter-Muslim warring, so Shia and Shia, the ambiguity doesn't lead to that. That's something else completely different, and it's as we were talking earlier, it's a political base for this. The ambiguity are quite subtle, and they're there for a specific purpose, and that purpose is a form of test. And the test, and that's apparent from the verse. It says because the people who have in their hearts this disease, whatever that disease might be, they will use the ambiguity because what ultimately they don't want to. So Islam is overarchingly means submitting your will to the will of the Creator. This in a nutshell, and that means you believe in the Creator as the Creator describes Himself, and you follow the messenger that comes to you and the way of living in the world that will give you an ultimately paradise. This is sort of part of that. Now, ultimately, there are people who don't really want to submit, and you find it's amazing the myriad of approaches that people use to justify that lack of submission. So some people come, and usually the underlying root is something much more basic, like, I want to go out with this girl, or I want to take this particular drug, or I want to make money really quickly in this particular way, or whatever that might be, because that's a way of following your desires. And the Quran talks about, have you not seen the people who made their desires their God? Because they're submitting to their desires, but not to the Creator. Other people bring intellectual things, like, I don't know, it's a common one that we see the atheists now. It's a modern thing the atheists use, I follow science, and science is silent, so until science says something, like I'm holding back. This is a way of submitting to the prophet of science, whoever that might be, Dawkins or Harris or whoever you're thinking about. But if you have these sorts of things in your heart, the ambiguities will amplify that. The person it ends up showing the true individual. Whereas if I see something ambiguous, my thought is, okay, this isn't quite clear. The next question in my mind is, what's more pleasing to the Creator that I do? And then you go down that route. Not what would I want? This makes it
and
easier
also
for
did
me.
the Prophet explain this? Did the companions explain
of course,
this?
that's part of that
Do we
process.
find this in Hadith? Now, if you reject all of that, then clearly you are a deviant. One other thing I just wanted to add very quickly is that even in a court of law, the law might be stipulated and recorded very accurately about a particular offence or activity or whatever, but you get two lawyers interpreting the law. So language itself has an element of ambiguity, or has an element of an ability to have some form of, let's say, interpretation.
So that one is that it's a test. That's the meaning of the last statement. The other thing is that actually some ambiguity can be merciful, and I can't explain this. So there were cases where the people would come to the Prophet and they would ask him questions about something, and the Prophet would not answer repeatedly. And then the Prophet told one, and I can't remember the name of the person, but told them, look, the things I have not told you a clear-cut answer of, it means that you have a choice in this. You have a choice of your options. If you ask me to specifically give you one answer, it will restrict all of the choices.
Life will become hard
to
for
one.
you.
So you make the religion will become burdensome upon you. So some of that aspect of the ambiguity is to allow people in their lives to have as much autonomy as you can. So Islam only has a few things it restricts. Most things are allowed. So we're talking about alcohol, narcotics, we're talking about illicit sexual relationships, we're talking about ways of dressing, for example. These are a small number of specific prohibitions or stipulations, and this is how you act. But the rest of it is fine. You want to go and eat this, you want to go out here and have fun and do this, no problem. But as long as these things are not part of that, you're okay. So there's a lot of freedom actually given, and restrictions are quite small. Long answers again, so my apologies. So sometimes, the ambiguity is not in the real things that will give you salvation. They're in the application that you have of the rules to your life in the world.
I think more importantly as well is that Allah is telling us Himself that I have deliberately created this scripture where there are explicit verses, and these make up the foundation of your religion. And then there are ambiguous ones. And then Allah tells us, and the people with a disease in their hearts will turn to those ambiguous verses. So Allah is telling us that this isn't something that we've now discovered afterwards, that, oh, Allah got it wrong, astaghfirullah. We don't say that. But Allah is telling us Himself that this is how I've constructed this scripture, and this is the reason why I did it the way I did. So, yeah.
We're just taking your time into consideration. We've spoken a lot.
Yeah.
I think the main purpose really is to let you know what we believe as Muslims, that there is only one creator, and that God has sent many prophets into the world with the same message, to worship God alone without partners. And the final messenger is Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, who comes with the same message as all of the previous prophets, to worship God alone. Even Jesus says in John 17:3 that this is eternal life, that they may know you, talking to the Father, the only true God, and Jesus Christ whom you have sent. So even in the biblical narrative, it's clear that there is one true God who is the one that we should be worshipping. And all what we're giving you is, because you're in this fascinating field of looking at the Sunni-Shia conflict.
We're actually quite fascinated because I do get very fascinated that Western people who actually don't have necessarily like a dog in the race, they're not really, immersed in this concept of religion or Islam or Arabic, and then you really go out your way to just, it's quite interesting actually.
But I think, it's presumptuous of me, I think you're being given an opportunity. There's access to something that most people in America probably wouldn't have access to.
Yeah.
And you're looking at the largest religion in the world, essentially. 2 billion people now, probably, if not on par with Christianity, soon to exceed Christianity in terms of numbers. Literally a fifth to a quarter of the world's population. And all they're saying to you is really worship God alone without partners. And this is the key core of the message. So you have access to people whose lives are affected by some other political thing, but they have this theological background. And I'd really love you to look into it. Because I think if you did, and you analysed it, I think it would become apparent that this is, the way.
And I think it would help you with your studies as well. Because,
yes, this has been very interesting
because when people who Shia or Sunni, when they have used theological justifications, you'll be better versed to say, actually, you know what? They might be saying that, but the general consensus was actually this. So it's clear that perhaps that using ambiguous verses might be coming in
so
here.
So if someone were to say, look, the Imams, they have knowledge of the unseen, you can say, well, doesn't your religious text say that God is the one who is the knower of the unseen? With him are the keys of the unknown. And then what they would have to do is then they have to justify that position according to the source message from the CEO. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So I think it would be, and I think that's your work-wise. But I think for you as an individual, you'd probably benefit from it because you seem to be on a journey. The schooling in the West is secular, and it does make our mindset come away from religious concepts. And we tend to look at religious things in an anachronistic way, that this is sort of
myths and
people didn't know really well, and as we're learning more, we're moving away from this. But the reality is that nothing is really well explained without holding to a universe in which there is a purpose for us here that means that we have meaning and value, and we can use our rationality in a systematic way to come to the truth. Because even if your rationality is part of the process, evolutionary process, it can't be as reliable as if it was given to you for a purpose of being used. But we've
probably said so much. There's a level of enthusiasm when we meet brothers and sisters who are like immersing themselves. Yeah,
Do you have a Quran? Would you like one? If I
have one back in the States. I didn't bring it with me.
Would you mind if we give you one now? Would that be okay? Yeah? I'll get you one from me.
Part of the things that we do speak quite a lot is because of the enthusiasm for the religion. Obviously, because we've studied it to some extent, and we want to share.
Yeah, you guys do definitely seem quite knowledgeable.
Well, and what it is, the Quran itself says, Allah says in the Quran, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, wal asr, inna al-insana lafi khusr, illa alladhina amanu wa amilu salihati wa tawasaw bil haqqi wa tawasaw bis sabr. So Allah says, I swear by time, humankind is at loss. And then Allah says, unless. So now Allah clarifies who are the people who are not at loss. He says, at loss unless you believe, you worship, you follow the teachings of Allah, you encourage others to the right, to goodness, i.e. what we're doing hopefully today, and you are patient. So Allah qualifies who are the people not at loss. So one of those obligations is to obviously save ourselves from loss, is to encourage the goodness, encourage the good to people, which is telling them about Islam.
If you thought that there was a fire here, and you're heading towards, and I was heading towards it, you'd say to me, even if you didn't know me, just out of decency, you'd say to me, excuse me, sir.
Please don't do that.
Just
don't go
stay
there.
away. Don't go that way because there's a fire there.
There's danger there, right?
So if we believe that there's a way to live in the world that will take you away from the hellfire and closer to God and paradise, it's almost out of love for our fellow human beings that we would inform you, and this is where it's coming from.
Yes.
So on that note, can I give you this is a copy of the Quran. This is a really good translation for the clear Quran. It lays out things really nicely for you. Brief biography of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon it. And this is any questions you might have, you come across. Our contact details are there. This is
An organization?
Yeah. So we're
just a group of guys,
people,
basically,
but what we try to do is we're
yeah.
trying to help as many people as we can.
Yeah.
So we've set up sort of contact emails and things, and our conversations can be found online. So you can always check them out. The details are there.
And I can also give you some resources of short talks about Shia-Sunni conflict.
Yeah, so if you want help with your
dissertation,
email us.
I'm not saying that I'm necessarily very knowledgeable
but we
on
can
that
always put you in
subject,
touch with
but we can
someone.
definitely put you in touch with people who can give you that theological grounding, which will definitely help you to counter some of the potential claims that you might hear from perhaps both sides.
Yeah.
So if you're interested in that, please just remind us of our conversation. And Brother Ayaz is over there. He's mashallah very hardworking. He will hopefully let us know that and we'll respond in kind and hopefully give you some
Lovely to
information.
meet you.
It was really nice.
Take it.
We don't touch hands with.
Sorry.
No, that's fine. It's out of respect. Because as a Muslim, we're not allowed to touch a woman who is not our wife, our sister, our daughter, or our mother.
Sorry.
So
And that's because out of the honor and respect for our sisters, and it just prevents, from the handshake, a shoulder rub or whatever.
Yeah.
It just prevents something perhaps potentially.
What it is you're precious as a human female, and because of that, no one has a right.
We're not permitted to.
So what? It's a limitation on us, and not
out of respect
because of your status.
Of lack
if you understand.
Yeah.
So don't
it's
take
not
it
out of lack
negative
of respect. It's actually out of respect.
Out of respect.
So please, it might seem sometimes a little bit rude, but it really doesn't come from that place at all.
We wish you all the best.
We really
Lovely to
wish
see
you all the best. It was very nice to meet you.